Welcome to Underworld UK, where Britain's darkest stories are brought to light. From the gritty streets of gangland London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, from Curtis Warren to the Cray twins to county lines and modern-day true crime, we cover everything. Bringing you new videos every week. Subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is put out.
Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new, welcome to the channel. Today I want to pay my respect to a character called Jimmy the Weed Donnelly and the Quality Street Mob. Jimmy has sadly recently passed away, so I just really want to pay my respects and tell you all about him, what a character he was, and how he was one of the founding members of the Quality Street Mob. Right, here we go. Manchester, a city built on industry, music and football. But behind the bright lights of the dance halls, the terraces and the booming nightlife, there was another side to the city, a darker side. In the 60s and 70s, Manchester's underworld was alive with characters who blurred the lines between local legends and feared gangsters. Men who held sway in pubs, nightclubs and back streets. Men whose names still echo through the city's history. And among them was a man simply known as Jimmy the Weed. Jimmy Donnelly wasn't the biggest or the most violent or even the richest gangster Manchester had ever seen, but he was one of the most recognisable, a sharp dresser, a quick wit and a natural storyteller. He had a way of being at the centre of everything without always being the man in the spotlight. Around him grew one of the most infamous groups in Manchester's criminal folklore, the Quality Street Gang. Part drinking club, part criminal fraternity, the Quality Street Gang had been remembered as a loose collection of hard men, crooks and chancers. To some, they were a myth, a story exaggerated by the press, but to others, they were a genuine force in Manchester's underworld. This is a story of Jimmy the Weed and the Quality Street Gang, a story where fact and legend collide, and where one man's charm and reputation helped to shape an entire era of Manchester's gangland. By the late 1960s, Manchester was changing. The old-fashioned gangs of the post-war years were fading, and a new generation of young men were making their presence felt in the pubs and clubs of the city centre. It was here, in the back rooms of the bars, in the smoke-filled snooker halls and the buzzing nightlife of Manchester, that the Quality Street Gang began to take shape. The name itself, as far as the story goes, is from a police officer who described them as a box of assorted characters, just like the chocolates, and in many ways the description stuck. Now they're saying that's where the name the Quality Street Gang came from. If anyone knows any different, please let us know in the comment section. Right, okay, so Jimmy the Weed became one of the founding members. He was the organiser, the social glue, the man who everybody knew. If there was a party, Jimmy was there. If it was business to be done, Jimmy knew who to call. And while he might not have been the one to throw the first punch, he was often the man in the room who made sure things went the way the gang wanted. His charm and connections gave the Quality Street Gang an air of respectability, but also notoriety. As the 1970s rolled in, the Quality Street Gang were becoming a mixture of Manchester life. Their presence in pubs, nightclubs, and on the city streets made them both feared and admired. And their reputation was only just beginning. By the 1970s, the Quality Street Gang were no longer just a group of lads drinking together. They had become an unmistakable presence in Manchester's underworld. There were faces you'd seen together in pubs of Salford, Deansgate, and the Northern Quarter. They stood out. Sharp suits, swagger, and a certain air of untouchability. To the police, they were a problem. To club owners and local businesses, they were a fact of life, and to many young Mancunians, they were legends. Men who represented glamour, toughness, and power. The Quality Street Gang weren't known for being ruthless killers like some other criminal outfits of the time. Instead, their reputation was built on presence. When they walked into a bar, the atmosphere changed. Few people were foolish enough to cross them. Jimmy the Weed thrived in this world. He wasn't a muscle, but he didn't need to be. His gift was knowing everyone who mattered. He was as comfortable sharing a drink with the fellow gangsters as he was talking to celebrities, musicians, or footballers. And make no mistake, the Quality Street Gang were connected. Stories have long circulated about their links to Manchester City and Manchester United footballers of the era. People were often spotted drinking in the same bars as the gang, with Jimmy acting as the go-between. There were even rumours of connections to the music world, whispers of the gang brushing shoulders with stars from Manchester's rising cultural scene. The truth of these tales is hard to pin down, but one thing is clear. The Quality Street Gang had influence that stretched far beyond the city's back streets. Police reports described them as Manchester's equivalent of the mafia, though in reality they were far more fluid, far less structured, but that didn't make them any less powerful. If you owned a nightclub, you wanted the Quality Street Gang to be on your side. If you didn't, you'd soon regret it. Protection rackets, debts, and intimidation were all part of their world. And though Jimmy liked to portray himself as a gentleman gangster, the truth was that the gang had real teeth when they needed to. Throughout the 70s, their name became almost untouchable. Newspapers reported on them. Police tried to pin them down. But the Quality Street Gang carried on regardless. And Jimmy the Weed, with his sharp dress sense and easy smile, remained right at the centre of it all. Behind the swagger and the sharp suits, the Quality Street Gang weren't just a couple of lads enjoying the nights out. They were involved in serious business. Protection rackets, loan sharking, and nightclub control were the backbone of their operations. If a pub or club in Manchester wanted to run without trouble, chances are they'd be paying the Quality Street Gang for the privilege. And if someone refused, well, the stories of smashed windows, intimidations, and beatings soon followed. The gang rarely needed to spill blood. Their reputation alone did much of the work for them. The police knew exactly who they were dealing with. Reports described them as the most influential crime group in Manchester. But proving anything was another matter. Jimmy the Weed in particular was a difficult man to pin down. He was always in the company of known faces, yet often managed to keep his own hands clean. He wasn't usually the man throwing punches or issuing threats. Instead, he was the talker, the connector, the one who smoothed things over while quietly ensuring the gang's control remained firm. But that didn't mean he was a saint. Jimmy had his fair share of arrests, and in later years he would spend time behind bars. Yet even then, his reputation as a gentleman gangster followed him. Guards, fellow prisoners, even judges, many spoke of him with a kind of a reluctant respect. But by the late 70s, police pressure on the Quality Street gang was growing. Raids, surveillance and operations were launched in an attempt to bring them down. But the gang were elusive, loose in structure, hard to infiltrate, and with deep connections in the city, they proved to be a nightmare for law enforcement. For ordinary Mancunians, the gang became part of local folklore. To some, they were villains, ruling the city through fear. To others, they were almost like folk heroes, men who embodied the grit and swagger of Manchester itself. By the 1980s, Manchester was a city changing fast. The old smoky pubs and dance halls gave way to nightclubs. And with the rise of the hacienda and the explosion of rave culture, a new kind of underworld began to take hold. The Quality Street gang, once untouchable, began to lose their grip. Younger, more ruthless groups were stepping into the spotlight. Gangs tied to the drug trade. Cocaine, heroin, and later ecstasy brought a different kind of violence to the streets. The Quality Street gang had always thrived on reputation, presence, and intimidation. But in a world dominated by drug cartels and heavily armed rivals, that style of gangsterism began to look old-fashioned. Jimmy the Weed, though still carried weight, his name was known, his face recognised, and his stories remembered. But he wasn't immune to the law. Over the years, Jimmy served prison time for various offences, including dealing in drugs, the very trade that would ultimately reshape Manchester's underworld. Yet even beyond bars, his reputation as a gentleman gangster followed him. He wasn't seen as a thug. He was a character, the man who could tell a story, who could make you laugh, who knew everyone and everything about Manchester's underworld. By the 90s, the Quality Street gang were no longer the feared force they once were. Time, police pressure, and the rise of new criminal outfits had taken their toll. Many of the original members drifted into obscurity, some into legitimate businesses, others into prison cells. But Jimmy remained in the public eye. In 2010, he published his autobiography, Jimmy the Weed, Inside the Quality Street Gang, co-written by Bernard Mahoney. In it, he told his side of the story, a mixture of hard truths, tall tales, and all the kind of stories only Jimmy could deliver. The book centered its place as not just a gangster, but a storyteller. For some, it was proof of his legendary status. For others, it was nothing more than tales of a career criminal. Whatever the truth, Jimmy the Weed had survived. He had outlasted many of his contemporaries and living long enough to see him become a cult figure in Manchester's history. Jimmy the Weed and the Quality Street Gang remain a unique part of Manchester's underworld history. They weren't the Krays, they weren't the Italian Mafia, but for 2 decades their presence loomed over Manchester. A collection of characters as colourful as they were feared, who built their reputation not just on crime but on image. For Jimmy Donnelly, life was about more than just money or power. It was about being a face, a name, a man who was part of the very fabric of Manchester. His charm, his sharp tongue, and his ability to tell a story meant that, long after the Quality Street Gang had faded, Jimmy's legend lives on. He was a man who blurred the line between villain and folk hero. To some, he was nothing more than a crook who lived off intimidation and crime. To others, he was a gentleman, a character who gave Manchester a story, a bit of swagger, and a legend that would outlive him. The Quality Street Gang may never have been as organised as the police claimed or as innocent as some locals like to remember. The truth lies somewhere in between, and that grey area is where fact and myth become inseparable. And Jimmy the Weed stood right at the heart of it. Today, his name still sparks conversations in Manchester pubs and on street corners. His book keeps his stories alive, and his memory remains tied forever to that strange, shadowy brotherhood of men who became known as the Quality Street Gang. In the end, Jimmy the Weed was more than just a gangster. He was a storyteller, and above all, a legend of Manchester's underworld. As mentioned earlier, Jimmy has a book which I own and I highly recommend, and let's keep his legacy alive and I'm trying to introduce the book to a new audience. If you haven't already got it, please go out and get it, and hopefully the proceeds will go to Jimmy's family. Okay, so I'm going to read out a couple of stories now from the book. Only a couple of stories because I don't want to spoil the book. I'd rather you go out and get the book yourself. So here we go. These are all Jimmy's own words taken from his book. My own reputation was made one Sunday night when I was 18. I walked into my local pub in Wythenshawe, ordered a bottle of Guinness and felt a tap on my shoulder. I heard you're a bit of a villain, this fellow said, and were involved in doing Derek Sutton. Well, if I was, what's it got to do with you? He introduced himself. I'm Jim Hancock. I'm the governor of Wythenshawe, and I don't like you or any of your market mob. So if you don't fuck off, I'm going to do you. I'd heard of Hancock around the neighbourhood, but our paths hadn't crossed yet. Wythenshawe covered a vast area, and he lived a couple of miles away from me. Now he was in my local with 5 mates, and I was all on my own. But I wasn't going to back down. This was a direct challenge, and there was no way out. If you want a row, get in the car park man to man, I said, loud enough so that his pals would hear that it had to be a fair fight. Out we went, and what a fight it was. We could both use our fists, and were both fit young men, and neither of us would quit. We fought for about 3/4 of an hour, no one getting the edge, until the end, with both of us virtually at a standstill, Someone says the police were coming. Okay, gasped Hancock, who was as knackered as I was. I think we've both had it. What do you say we go and have a drink? That was a story about how Jimmy got his reputation. There's a lot more to that story, but again, I'll go and urge you to go and buy the book. But I'm going to read out another story from the book now about how it all started with the Quality Street Gang. The group that became known as the Quality Street Gang began to gather together around 1967 when I was 27. A band of 8 or 10 close friends became 20, then 30. Most of us had known each other for years. Some were straight businessmen, some were rogues, some were a mixture of the two, leaning more in one direction or the other depending on circumstance or opportunity. Many had backgrounds in similar occupations: the markets, car sales, scrap metal, door security. We could all look after ourselves, and when some of us were very, very hard men indeed. At heart, we were a bunch of mates, many from the Ancoats area. We both enjoyed each other's company and socially and dealing together in business. And really, that's all there was to it. We were not a gang in the usual sense. There was no limitation, no membership, no hierarchy, and no rules. In fact, had it not been for the Joker comment one night which gave us our name, I do not think we would ever have been labelled a gang at all. A better word to describe us might be network. A group of web of interlocking and mutual beneficial friendships between men from poor backgrounds who were trying to make something of themselves. Outwardly, we appeared little different from any other group of blokes out on the town. A few more flat noses and cars and scars, but that was it. We even had our own Sunday football team for a while, known simply as QSG. But our bonds were deeper than normal. In a sense, we felt it was us against the world. The original core of our little band consisted of no more than a dozen men, many of us of immigrant descent. Perhaps that's why we felt like outsiders. The leader, figurehead for a better word, was undoubtedly Jim Swords. We gathered around Jimmy. He is a great example of why the police and press misunderstood the QSG. Jimmy was not a thief, he was a market lad, then a professional boxer, then a stall holder, then a successful car dealer, and finally a property developer. He made money legitimately, if you could call the car game in those days legitimate, and he invested it shrewdly. Yes, he had a criminal record, but mainly for fighting when he was younger. He did not rob banks. He didn't demand money protection or sell drugs. He was simply his own man, living not by society's rules, but by his own. Jim once said to me, "Even if you are wrong, you are right." So, what are we all about? There is no wrong. It was never his way. It was his way of saying, never complain, never explain. Jimmy also used to say, never put a mug before your family. And his closest companion was his brother Joe. They looked alike, and as a pair they were a bit like the Cray twins, two ex-boxers who could fight for fun and took absolutely no crap off anyone. They reminded me of the Crays in another way, in that they could both wind each other up or calm each other down, depending on our moods. I did not meet Joe until he was 16. as he'd spent a lot of his childhood in approved schools and borstalls. We eventually became great pals and would share in many ventures. Joe was utterly trustworthy, a deep thinker, and dangerous man if he had to be. So there you have it. That was my tribute and respect paid to Jimmy the Weed Donnelly. I've only read out tiny segments of his book. I really urge you to go and get it if you want to hear more stories. There's so many stories, and there's lots I've left out about, he was connected to with Manchester United, the manager, how he got his name, meeting all the legends, the song named after him. There's so much more to tell. Okay, I might do a part 2 about the Quality Street Gang, but I really urge you to go out and buy the book. I will leave a link in the description if you do want to buy the book. Thank you guys. Please, if you did enjoy this video and you want to hear more crime stories, please subscribe, give us a like, give us a comment. It all helps the channel grow, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. See you next time.